This is Richard Radio, and tonight we're diving into something that still gives me chills when I think about it. 3 years ago, something happened that changed everything we thought we knew about our own government, our military, and what they're willing to do to maintain control. What I'm about to share with you comes from 3 survivors of what's been classified as the Dark Sky Protocol, a military operation so secret, so devastating, that most people still don't know it ever happened. I've spent months verifying these accounts, cross-referencing details, and I can tell you with certainty, this is real. Tonight, you'll hear from Marcus Chon, a former communications officer stationed at Fort Riverside, Dr. Elena Vasquez, a biochemist who worked for the CDC, and Sarah Thompson, a civilian nurse who witnessed the aftermath firsthand. Their stories intersect in ways that will make you question everything you think you know about the events of 2021. So settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself for the truth about the Dark Sky Protocol.
My name is Marcus Chen, and 3 years ago I was a staff sergeant in the Army's 35th Signal Battalion, stationed at Fort Riverside in Nevada. I had a Level 3 security clearance, which meant I handled some pretty sensitive communications, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I stumbled across on October 15, 2021. It started like any other night shift. I was monitoring encrypted military channels, routine stuff mostly, supply requests, training schedules, weather, reports. Then around 2:30 a.m., a new frequency started broadcasting. The call sign was Darksky Actual, and the encryption level was way above my clearance. But here's the thing about military comms equipment. Sometimes there are glitches, overlapping, frequencies that let you hear things you're not supposed to. The first transmission I intercepted was brief. Phase 1 initiated. Substance deployed via aerosol dispersal. Estimated coverage zone encompasses civilian populations within 50-mile radius of designated urban centers. I thought it was a training exercise at first. We ran drills all the time. But something felt wrong. The voices were too tense, too urgent. Real operations have a different rhythm than exercises. I'd been doing this for 8 years. I knew the difference. Over the next 4 hours, I logged 17 separate transmissions, each one more disturbing than the last. They were talking about something called compound helix 7, a chemical agent that caused what they termed neural pathway disruption leading to aggressive behavioral modification. The scariest part wasn't the technical jargon. It was how clinical they sounded. These weren't soldiers discussing a threat to American citizens. They were discussing American citizens as the target. Around 6 a.m., I heard the transmission that made my blood run cold. Civilian casualties within acceptable parameters. Media blackout protocols in effect. Prepare for Phase 2 implementation. I knew I had to document everything. I started recording the transmissions on a personal device, something that could have gotten me court-martialed, but I felt like I didn't have a choice. People needed to know what was happening. The last transmission I intercepted before they changed frequencies was, Dark Sky Protocol is now active. All personnel are reminded that disclosure of any operational details constitutes treason under the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 847B. Violators will be processed accordingly. That's when I realized I wasn't just overhearing classified information. I was listening to my own government implement what could only be described as a chemical weapons attack on American soil. By 7 a.m., the base was in complete lockdown. No one in, no one out. All external communications were severed. We were told it was a routine security drill, but I'd never seen anything like it. Military police were stationed at every exit, armed and looking serious as heart attacks. For 3 days, we were essentially prisoners on our own base. The official story was that there had been a terrorist incident in Las Vegas and several other major cities. Chemical attacks, they said. Foreign agents had contaminated the water supply with something that made people violent and unpredictable. But I knew better. I had the recordings. On the 4th day, 2 men in civilian clothes showed up at my barracks. They weren't military. I could tell by how they carried themselves. They wore suits that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. And they had that particular kind of confidence that comes from having clearance levels most people can't even pronounce. Sergeant Chen, the taller one, said, "We understand you've been having some technical difficulties with your communications equipment." I played dumb. "Sir, I'm not sure what you mean." "Frequency interference. Sometimes signals overlap. Sometimes people hear things that aren't meant for their ears." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We're here to help resolve any confusion you might be experiencing." They spent 2 hours in that room with me. They never raised their voices. They never threatened me directly, but they made it very clear that if I had somehow obtained any recordings of classified transmissions, my patriotic duty was to turn them over immediately. They also made it clear what happened to soldiers who forgot their oath to protect national security. I gave them a device, but it wasn't the device with the real recordings. I'd hidden those somewhere safe, somewhere off base. Call it paranoia, call it survival instinct, I don't know. But something told me those recordings were the only thing keeping me alive. After they left, things went back to what passed for normal. The lockdown was lifted. The terrorist attack dominated the news cycle for a few weeks, then gradually faded from public attention. Official casualty numbers were released: 847 dead, 2,300 injured across 5 major cities. The story was that foreign terrorists had contaminated municipal water supplies with a psychoactive compound that caused temporary psychosis. But the numbers didn't add up. The timeline didn't make sense. And I had 17 audio files that told a completely different story. I spent months trying to figure out what to do with what I knew. I couldn't go to my commanding officer. For all I knew, he was part of it. I couldn't go to the media without proof, and releasing the recordings would definitely constitute treason. I couldn't even talk to my family about it. The isolation was the worst part. Having this knowledge, knowing what our own government was capable of, and not being able to share it with anyone, I started having nightmares. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. My performance reviews started slipping. Finally, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I took early discharge. Cited PTSD, which wasn't entirely a lie. The Army was happy to let me go. One less potential liability walking around with clearance and knowledge they couldn't fully control. But leaving the military didn't mean leaving the story behind. If anything, it made me more determined to find the truth. I started researching the terrorist attacks of October 2021. I reached out to survivors, to families of victims, to anyone who might have noticed inconsistencies in the official narrative. That's how I found Dr. Elena Vasquez.
Marcus found me through a support group for government whistleblowers. I was using a pseudonym, of course, but he somehow figured out who I was. When he first contacted me, I thought he was either crazy or working for them. The paranoia never really goes away, you know? Once you've seen what they're willing to do to protect their secrets, you start seeing potential threats everywhere. But Marcus was persistent. He shared just enough details to make me realize he might be legitimate. More importantly, he had information that corroborated what I'd witnessed from inside the CDC. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez. 3 years ago, I was a senior biochemist with the Centers for Disease Control, specializing in rapid response protocols for chemical and biological terrorism. I had been with the agency for 12 years, worked on everything from anthrax scares to ricin investigations. I thought I understood the full scope of chemical weapons and their effects on human populations. I was wrong. On October 16, 2021, I was part of a rapid response team deployed to Las Vegas. We'd been told that terrorists had contaminated the city's water supply with an unknown psychoactive compound. Our job was to identify the substance, determine its effects, and develop a treatment protocol. What we found didn't match anything in our databases. The victims, and I use that word deliberately, showed symptoms unlike anything I'd ever seen. The official reports described temporary psychosis leading to aggressive behavior, but that was sanitized bureaucratic language designed to hide the truth. These people hadn't just become aggressive. They'd become something else entirely. The compound, whatever it was, seemed to target specific neurological pathways. It didn't just make people violent. It made them systematically, methodically violent. They retained enough cognitive function to use tools, to plan attacks, to coordinate with other affected individuals. But they'd lost something essentially human. Empathy, self-preservation, the ability to recognize loved ones as anything other than potential threats. I remember the first victim I examined, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher named Jennifer Walsh. According to witness reports, she'd attacked her own children with a kitchen knife before police subdued her. When I met her, she was restrained in a medical facility, completely calm and lucid. "Doctor," she said to me, "I understand you're here to help me. I want you to know that I feel completely normal. I'm not experiencing any distress or confusion. I simply need to kill everyone I see. It's not an emotional response. It's more like hunger or thirst, a biological imperative I can't ignore." She said this with the same tone you might use to ask for a glass of water. The most disturbing part was that she was right. All her vital signs were normal. Her cognitive function was unimpaired. She could solve complex mathematical problems, discuss literature, even express concern for her family's well-being. But something in her brain had been fundamentally rewired to prioritize violence above everything else, including her own survival. Over the next 3 days, I examined 47 victims. They all told variations of the same story. They felt fine. They understood their actions were socially unacceptable. They simply couldn't stop themselves from wanting to hurt people. The youngest victim was 12 years old. The oldest was 73. The compound seemed to affect everyone equally, regardless of age, health status, or previous psychological condition. On the 4th day, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was analyzing blood samples when I noticed something odd about the chemical structure of the compound. It wasn't some crude terrorist weapon cooked up in a basement lab. This was sophisticated, precisely engineered, with molecular markers that suggested years of development and testing. More importantly, I recognized some of the base compounds. They were derivatives of research I'd seen in classified military documents during a joint CDC-DoD project I'd worked on in 2018. That's when I realized we weren't dealing with a terrorist attack. We were dealing with a field test. I tried to discuss my findings with the team leader, Dr. Morrison. He listened to my concerns, took copies of my analysis, and told me he'd look into it. The next morning, I was reassigned to a different project and ordered to return to Atlanta immediately. But before I left, I made copies of everything: blood samples, test results, chemical analysis reports, witness interviews. I smuggled them out in a false bottom of my equipment case, a trick I'd learned from a colleague who'd worked in some very unfriendly countries. Back in Atlanta, I tried to continue my investigation quietly. I reached out to contacts in the military, medical community, tried to trace the origins of the compound, looked for any other incidents with similar characteristics. What I found terrified me. There had been smaller-scale incidents over the previous 2 years. A nursing home in rural Montana, where residents suddenly became violent. A small town in Oregon, where contaminated well water led to a mass psychotic episode. A military housing complex in Virginia, where families turned on each other overnight. Each incident had been explained away. Food poisoning, mass hysteria, isolated outbreaks of an unknown pathogen. But the symptoms were always the same, and the chemical signatures were always variants of the same base compound. Someone had been testing this weapon for years, perfecting it, scaling up for larger deployments. Las Vegas wasn't the beginning, it was the culmination. I spent 6 months trying to figure out what to do with this information. I couldn't go through official channels. It was clear that at least some people in the CDC were aware of and potentially complicit in what was happening. I couldn't go to the media without risking not just my career, but my life. Finally, I decided to reach out to other potential witnesses. That's how I found the support group where Marcus eventually contacted me. It's also how I met Sarah Thompson. Sarah had been there, on the ground, during the worst of it. She'd seen things that even my clinical reports couldn't fully capture. Her story filled in the gaps that my scientific analysis had left open.
My name is Sarah Thompson, and 3 years ago, I was working as an emergency room nurse at University Medical Center in Las Vegas. October 2021 was supposed to be a quiet month for us. Tourist season was winding down, the weather was cooling off, and we were actually running below capacity for the first time in months. That all changed on the morning of October 16th. I came in for my shift at 6 a.m., and the first thing I noticed was the unusual number of police cars in the parking lot. Not just regular patrol units, tactical vehicles, federal agents, people in hazmat suits. The kind of response you'd expect for a major chemical spill or terrorist attack. The charge nurse briefed us quickly. There had been multiple incidents across the city overnight. Water contamination was suspected. Victims were showing signs of acute psychosis and violent behavior. We were to treat them as potentially dangerous and maintain strict isolation protocols. What she didn't tell us, what none of us were prepared for, was just how organized these psychotic patients could be. The first victim came in around 7:30 a.m., a 28-year-old accountant named David Kim. He'd been brought in by police after attacking his roommate with a baseball bat. He was conscious, cooperative, and completely lucid. He answered questions appropriately, followed instructions, and seemed genuinely remorseful about what he'd done. "I don't understand what happened," he told me while I was drawing blood. "I woke up this morning, and all I could think about was hurting Mark. Not because I was angry with him, not because of any argument we'd had. I just needed to hurt him, like I needed to breathe or eat." 15 minutes later, while I was labeling his blood samples, David somehow managed to break free from his restraints. He'd been working at the leather straps quietly, methodically, while maintaining casual conversation with the staff. When he got loose, he didn't rage or scream. He simply walked over to the medical cart and picked up a scalpel. It took 4 security guards to subdue him, and even then, he never lost that eerily calm demeanor. "I'm not angry," he kept saying as they restrained him. "I just need to cut someone. It's nothing personal." By noon, we had 37 similar cases. Each patient was lucid, articulate, and driven by an inexplicable compulsion toward violence. They could plan, problem solve, and even work together when the opportunity arose. The scariest incident happened around 2 p.m. 3 patients, a grandmother, a college student, and a construction worker who'd never met each other before, somehow coordinated an escape attempt. They'd been housed in separate rooms, but they'd figured out how to communicate through the ventilation system. They'd made weapons from medical equipment, disabled the locks on their doors, and nearly made it to the pediatric ward before we stopped them. When we asked them why they were trying to reach the children's area, the grandmother, a sweet woman, named Dorothy, who'd taught Sunday school for 30 years, looked at us like we were idiots. "Children are easier targets," she said matter-of-factly. "They can't fight back effectively, and their screams would create chaos that would make it easier for us to access more victims." She said this while knitting a scarf that one of her grandchildren had started for her. Her hands never stopped moving, never missed a stitch, even while she was describing the most efficient ways to kill children. That's when I realized this wasn't just a chemical attack. This was something much worse. These people retained their intelligence, their memories, their personalities. But something fundamental about their humanity had been erased. The worst part was how quickly it spread. Not the chemical itself. That seemed to be limited to people who'd consumed contaminated water. But the violence became contagious in other ways. Family members trying to help their affected loved ones got hurt. First responders became targets. Even hospital staff started showing signs of trauma-induced aggression, after dealing with patient after patient who looked at them like prey. By the third day, we were operating under martial law. The hospital was surrounded by military personnel. No one could enter or leave without authorization. Families couldn't visit their loved ones. Media was completely blocked from the area. That's when the execution started. I don't know what else to call them. Officially, they were emergency euthanasia procedures for terminally affected individuals. But I was there. I saw what happened. A team of doctors and military personnel would go room to room, evaluating patients. Anyone who showed signs of the violent compulsions was given a lethal injection. No appeals process. No second opinions. No family consultation. I watched them kill 127 people over 2 days. People who were otherwise healthy. People who could still think and speak and recognize their families. People whose only terminal condition was that they wanted to hurt others. The victims knew what was happening. They understood that they were going to be killed, and most of them agreed it was necessary. That might have been the most disturbing part of all, watching someone calmly discuss their own execution while expressing regret that they wouldn't get the chance to kill anyone first. Dorothy, the Sunday school teacher, was one of the last to go. Before they gave her the injection, she asked if she could finish the scarf she was knitting. "My granddaughter Sarah will want this when school starts," she said. "She gets cold easily, just like her mother did at that age." Then, without any change in tone, she added, "I do hope someone kills her quickly when this spreads to other cities. I'd hate for her to suffer." She died, holding that half-finished scarf, still worried about a grandchild she wanted to murder. After it was over, after the bodies were removed and the rooms were sanitized, the official story started to take shape. Terrorist attack, foreign agents, contaminated water supply. The number of casualties was drastically underreported. They only counted people who died from the chemical itself, not the hundreds who were euthanized to prevent further violence. Those of us who'd been there were required to sign extensive, non-disclosure agreements. We were told that revealing details about the incident could compromise national security and potentially trigger copycat attacks. Anyone who violated their NDA would face federal prosecution for treason. Most of my colleagues signed without question. They wanted to forget what they'd seen, wanted to move on with their lives. But I couldn't let it go. Too many people had died. Too many families had been destroyed. And the official story didn't explain the most important question. How had this happened? I started doing my own research. I reached out to other first responders, other medical personnel who'd been involved in similar incidents. That's how I found the support group, where I eventually met Elena and Marcus. When Marcus played me those audio recordings, when Elena showed me her chemical analysis, everything finally made sense. This hadn't been a terrorist attack. This had been our own government testing a chemical weapon on American citizens. The three of us spent months comparing our information, verifying details, building a complete picture of what had really happened. What we discovered was worse than any of us had imagined.
The pieces started coming together when we combined our information. Elena's scientific analysis proved that the compound was domestically produced. Sarah's first-hand account confirmed that the effects were exactly what the military transmissions had described. And my recordings provided the smoking gun, direct evidence that this was a planned operation, not a terrorist attack. But we still didn't know why. Why would our own government deploy a chemical weapon against its own citizens? What was the strategic objective? What did they hope to accomplish? The answer came from an unlikely source, a janitor named Pete Kowalski. Pete worked at a classified research facility outside Reno, Nevada. He had basic security clearance, just enough to empty trash cans and clean bathrooms in certain areas of the building. But Pete was also a veteran, and he paid attention to things most people ignored. He reached out to me after seeing a post I'd made on a veterans forum, asking if anyone had noticed unusual military activity in Nevada during October 2021. Pete had noticed and he had information that tied everything together. The facility where Pete worked was run by a private defense contractor called Meridian Solutions. They specialized in what they called population management technologies, a euphemism for weapons designed to control civilian populations during periods of civil unrest. According to documents Pete had seen in the trash, Dark Sky Protocol was part of a larger program called Social Stability Initiative. The idea was to develop methods for rapidly suppressing large-scale civil unrest without the political complications of traditional military intervention. Think about it from their perspective. What happens when climate change, economic collapse, or political upheaval leads to widespread rioting? How do you restore order without images of soldiers shooting American citizens dominating the news cycle? The compound used in Dark Sky Protocol was designed to solve that problem. Release it into the water supply of a major city during periods of unrest. Within 24-48 hours, affected individuals become extremely violent, but also extremely vulnerable to defensive action by law enforcement. You can kill hundreds or thousands of people while claiming you were protecting innocent civilians from chemically induced terrorists. The Las Vegas test wasn't about perfecting the weapon itself. It was about perfecting the cover story. They needed to know if they could convince the public that affected individuals were terrorists rather than victims. They needed to test whether the media would accept the official narrative without too much investigation. They needed to see if they could contain the story geographically and politically. By all measures, the test was a success. The public bought the terrorist attack story. The media moved on to other stories within weeks. The few people who questioned the official narrative were dismissed as conspiracy theorists. And most importantly, no one connected the Las Vegas incident to the smaller test cases that had preceded it. Pete provided us with internal memos describing the post-incident analysis. The researchers were pleased with the results, but noted several areas for improvement. The compound needed to be more stable in different water systems. The behavioral effects needed to be more predictable and longer lasting, and they needed better methods for ensuring that all affected individuals were eliminated before they could provide testimony that might contradict the official narrative. In other words, they were already planning the next test.
Happened. We had to prevent it from happening again. But how do you stop a classified military program when you're just 3 civilians with no official authority and no way to verify our claims without revealing classified information? We decided our best option was to go public, but we needed a platform that would reach enough people to make suppression difficult. That's why we're here tonight, talking to Richard. We've also prepared detailed documentation that we're releasing, simultaneously through multiple channels: independent journalists, international media, and secure file-sharing networks. We know this is dangerous. We know that by speaking out, we're making ourselves targets. But we also know that staying silent means accepting responsibility for whatever happens next time they deploy this weapon. The people who died in Las Vegas, in Montana, in Oregon, and Virginia, they weren't terrorists. They weren't enemies of America. They were American citizens who were used as test subjects in an illegal weapons program. They deserve to be remembered as victims, not as threats that had to be eliminated. But more than that, the American people deserve to know what their government is capable of. They deserve to understand that the next time there's a terrorist attack involving mass violence and chemical contamination, they should ask hard questions about who really benefits from that attack. Dark Sky Protocol isn't over. It's just waiting for the right crisis to provide cover for its deployment. Economic collapse, disputed elections, climate disasters, foreign conflicts. Any of these could trigger the next phase of testing. The weapon exists. The protocols are in place. The legal framework for mass executions has been established under the guise of emergency response. The only thing standing between us and the next Las Vegas is public awareness. If people know to look for the signs, if they know to question the official narratives, if they understand the difference between real terrorism and state-sponsored violence disguised as counterterrorism, then maybe we can prevent this from happening again. Or maybe not. Maybe the system is too powerful, too entrenched, too willing to sacrifice American lives for strategic objectives. But we have to try. We owe it to the victims. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to everyone who might become a target in the future.
Dorothy and her unfinished scarf. I think about her granddaughter Sarah, wondering if she ever found out what really happened to her grandmother. Wondering if she believes the official story about terrorist attacks and contaminated water. I think about all the families who were told their loved ones died heroically, defending others from chemically induced violence. Families who were given medals and certificates of appreciation for their loss. Families who don't know their relatives were actually victims of their own government's weapons testing. The hardest part is the isolation. Even now, even talking to Marcus and Elena, even knowing that other people understand what really happened, most of the time, I'm surrounded by people who have no idea. They see news reports about chemical attacks and terrorism, and they trust that their government is protecting them from foreign threats. They don't realize that sometimes the biggest threat comes from within. I keep working as a nurse because I believe in helping people heal. But every day, I wonder if I'll recognize the symptoms if it happens again. Every patient who comes in with unusual behavioral changes, every news report about unexplained violence, every government press conference about new security measures, I'm always watching for signs that Dark Sky Protocol has been activated again. Maybe that's paranoia. Maybe the Las Vegas incident really was a one-time test, and they've moved on to other methods of population control. But I don't think so. I think they're just waiting for the right opportunity, the right crisis, the right political climate to deploy their weapon on a larger scale. When that happens, and I believe it will happen, most people won't recognize it for what it is. They'll see the news reports about terrorist attacks and chemical contamination, and they'll trust their government to handle the crisis appropriately. They'll support emergency measures and martial law and mass executions, because they'll believe it's necessary to protect innocent people from dangerous terrorists. They won't realize they're watching their own neighbors and family members being murdered to cover up a government weapons test. That's why we're telling this story. Not because we expect everyone to believe us. Not because we think we can single-handedly expose and stop a classified military program. But because maybe, when it happens again, a few people will remember what we've said tonight. Maybe they'll ask the right questions, or refuse to accept the official explanations, or demand real accountability from their elected representatives. Maybe they'll remember Dorothy, knitting a scarf for a granddaughter she wanted to kill, dying, with dignity, while her government covered up its crimes. Maybe that will be enough to make a difference.
We're not asking anyone to take our word for this. We're asking people to think critically about the information they receive from official sources, especially during crisis situations. When the next terrorist attack happens, and there will be a next time, ask yourself these questions. Who benefits from this crisis? What new powers or authorities are being justified by this emergency? Are the victims' stories consistent with the official explanation? Are independent investigators being given access to evidence, or are they being blocked by security concerns? Most importantly, remember that the greatest atrocities in history have always been committed by people who convinced themselves they were protecting civilization from dangerous threats. The people who implemented Dark Sky Protocol probably believe they're heroes, defending America from chaos and violence. They're not heroes. They're war criminals who have figured out how to make their crimes look like heroic responses to terrorism. The recordings I made 3 years ago are now public record. Elena's chemical analysis is available for independent verification. Sarah's witness testimony is documented and corroborated. We've provided everything we can to support our claims. What happens next is up to all of you listening tonight. You can dismiss this as conspiracy theory and go back to trusting that your government would never harm American citizens for strategic purposes. Or you can remember that governments throughout history have committed unspeakable acts against their own people, usually while claiming it was necessary for national security. The choice is yours. But remember, the next time Dark Sky Protocol is activated, you might not get advance warning. You might not have time to research the truth or question the official narrative. You might just see the news reports about terrorist attacks and chemical contamination, and you might trust your government to handle the crisis appropriately. By then, it will be too late.
Testimonies you've heard from Marcus Chun, Dr. Elena Vasquez, and Sarah Thompson represent thousands of hours of investigation, verification, and documentation. The evidence they've compiled is now publicly available through secure channels, and I encourage you to examine it for yourselves. I want to thank these three individuals for their courage in coming forward. They've risked everything to share this information with the public, knowing that it could cost them their freedom or their lives. That kind of bravery deserves our respect and our attention. Whether you believe their account or not, the questions they've raised are important ones. In an era of increasing government secrecy and expanding emergency powers, we all need to remain vigilant about who we trust and why we trust them. As always, think for yourselves, question everything, and remember that the truth is rarely as simple as the official story makes it seem. This has been Richard Radio, and you've been listening to the radio, fictional stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe.